Hello and welcome to episode number one of women's health series. We're going to basically do it based on age for women, and we're going to start with young women and hormones. So, Janet, where would you like to start?
Let's start with our young teenage girls, because I think that's where our health is really important. Obviously, preteen is important too, but our teenage gals need some guidance. And whether you're the teen or the mother or a family member, I think we lack a lot of knowledge as going into this age of life. And the reason I feel it's super important is because, as you know, this is prior to planning a family and having children. And if we don't get it right when we're teens, there can be some consequences. So let's start out, Shawn, with the topic of what happens to young women when we have unregulated cycles.
Okay, well, what is an unregulated cycle, and when does a teenage woman usually start cycling? Or I should say, when does a young woman? Because some women will start before they're teenagers. So tell us what looks normal for that, Janet.
It really depends on
if there's a normal.
Right. It really depends on the individual. And where we start getting into problems is when we have cycles that are heavy or very quick in between, or maybe spread way out. And that might not be a big deal when we're very young in our teenage years of puberty. But as we get older into our 19 and 20, we want those cycles to be more regular. And that can look different for each woman. On average, we're looking at about 25 days and then a menses, but that can be different on each person. So don't get put in a box over that. But where we start having issues is when we start having really heavy cycles that are erratic, or if we start having cycles that we start having acne breakout, or we start having headaches. And the headaches and the acne is probably one of the first things that brings the young lady into their physician's office.
And what really creates what are some things that are important to have a regular cycle, whatever regular means? And I guess when we say regular, Janet already alluded to that, but when you start skipping cycles, that's when there's a problem. So what are some things that young women can do to make sure their cycles are regular, Janet?
Well, it sounds strange to say this, but it all really comes down to healthy living choices. So Shawn and I talk a lot about that for perimenopausal and menopausal women, but it starts really in our teenage years. So getting good rest is extremely important, because when you start cycling, you need to recover. It is something that your body is going through. It's dynamic. It's a change. So sleep is super important. So if you're not getting 8 hours of sleep, which I know it sounds really crazy to a young teenager, but it's true, because your body is growing and changing and developing. So sleep is super important. So good sleep hygiene, which could be what?
Well, actually, I think for teenagers, they need more than 8 hours, at least 8 hours, maybe 8 to 9. Unfortunately, most teenagers don't do that. And good sleep hygiene is this. It's like, remember, think about what our ancestors did. They went to bed when the sun went down, and they got up when the sun came up. Now, I will say this. The further northern you live, the more dramatic that is, obviously. So, we live up in Washington State, and it gets dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're still at work. So, and it won't get light until 7:30 in the morning. So sometimes we're up before daylight. So that's all kind of relative. But what you really want to do is you want to be consistent with going to bed at night at about the same time, within an hour of each other. So if your bedtime is 10 o'clock, you want to go to bed between 9 and 11 o'clock all the time. And don't cheat even on weekends. So maybe you can cheat on weekends and go to bed at 11 o'clock instead of 9 o'clock, but you don't want to by and large, cheat. And then you want to get up at the same time regularly. So if you go to bed at 10, get up at 6. You want 8 hours. And you want to do that regularly and get your body scheduled to do that. And because remember, we're meant to sleep at night and work or move during the day. So get into that regular schedule. That's what's important for recovery. You don't get stronger when you work out. You don't get stronger when you eat. You get stronger and you recover when you sleep.
Right. So the second thing that I think is extremely important, especially in the world that we are existing in, is quality of food. And I'm sure anybody that's listened to our podcasts or our topics, diet is super important. So as a young woman, you are laying down muscle tissue as well as bones to prepare for adulthood. And if you are eating things that are so processed that are coming from the inside of the grocery store instead of the perimeter, or if you're eating a lot of fast food or processed food or just junk food in general, which sometimes we think we can get away with in our society, like, oh, I'm young and it's okay. But really, that's like the last thing you want to do. You want to eat a clean diet as you can. That food is going to be the fuel to build your body.
You are preparing your body for years.
Right.
It's not just for now, it's for years in the future. And when we talk about cycling, let's get back on that topic. Think about why women cycle. Why do women cycle? Women cycle to get pregnant. And if you're not cycling regularly, that means you're probably not healthy, because after you've started cycles anyway, because your body recognizes if you're ready to be pregnant or not.
Right.
So we will see many young women come into our pharmacy and they are not cycling, and they're in their young 20s and they're trying to get pregnant. And one of the problems is they're not metabolically healthy.
Right.
One of the problems is, like Janet was saying, they're eating the wrong food. Well, when you're eating the wrong food and you're not metabolically healthy, your body says, you know what? This woman is not healthy enough to carry another human, another child. So what the body says is like, you know what? I'm not going to cycle. That way I can't get pregnant.
Right.
And it's a dietary issue.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to a doctor, they prescribe birth control for you, you don't lack birth control. Let me tell you. In fact, birth control will make the problem worse. Mm-hmm. Birth control is synthetic estrogen and synthetic progestins. And what they literally do is shut down the body's own production of natural estradiol and natural progesterone. One of the reasons you're not cycling is because your body's not making enough progesterone. So right. When they give you birth control, it will make the problem worse in the long run. You need to fix the metabolic health problem.
Right.
Janet?
You're right. So the complex part of this is, even when they put young girls on birth control, it still doesn't always solve the issue. So you will have women that'll have acne problems, they'll have cycling problems, and it's being masked or maybe just more tolerable for them. And polycystic ovary syndrome is something that we see a lot of.
PCOS.
And many times it starts when you're teenager or early 20s. And like Shawn said, the problem is that we actually put the body in a menopausal phase. So you're shutting down the production of those hormones that your ovaries would naturally make. So where this becomes a problem is under fertility in the future, bone growth, because now your body doesn't know how to make good, strong bones. Your muscle tissue, we aren't building good muscle tissue. And why is that important? Well, because we want to live long lives, right? In your teenage years, you don't really think about that, but this is the time that you start laying down the good foundation to be a healthy, mature adult. And women who have had this cycle thing going on and on and on, the problem is when you stop taking the birth control pills, then we still have that underlying problem that we haven't solved. And many times it turns into this inflammatory issue where, they might get pregnant, but then they abort the baby. And miscarriages in that first trimester and maybe early part of the second trimester really come down to a lack of progesterone, not something synthetic that, people think that we should do, but it's actually a hormone that your ovaries should be making, and that should start in your teen years.
Yeah, it's anytime you're having a cycling issue, it's lack of progesterone, and birth control pills can make that worse. So what happens when you get when you're given progesterone is it tries to get you regulated back on natural cycles.
Right.
So, and progesterone literally means this, progestation. So when a young woman takes progesterone, yes, she will be more fertile, definitely.
Right.
And I will tell you, yes, that might be a problem, but it doesn't have to be a problem. And I will tell you this, I'm speaking for Janet here, but we have seen so many long-term side effects from birth control.
Mm-hmm.
Birth control pills are one of the class of drugs I would never, ever recommend, because long-term, it can set you up for infertility issues,
Mm-hmm.
bone density issues, cardiovascular problems,
Right.
all kinds of problems in the
Right.
future. So birth control pills, in my opinion, are an absolute no-no.
So
But
there's a term called do no harm. And really what Shawn is piggybacking on is we're alluding to all the harm that these products cause. And there's a slew of them. And I will be very honest, that's one of the decisions that Shawn and I made in our relationship was to go on the birth control pill. And one of the problems that happened during pregnancy was fibroids because I was on a pill. So synthetic estrogen is not the answer to helping with cycles. The answer comes down to one of the oldest hormones that is known to man is progesterone. And we can't say that enough. A lot of times, even with my older women, it's progesterone, progesterone, progesterone. But even my youngest patients, oh my goodness, oh yes, that is the starting point of health to make sure that those cycles are right. So Shawn, let's describe really short and quick about what a cycle looks like between estrogen and progesterone so they can understand why we keep saying that with the cycle.
There's two phases of the cycle, the luteal phase and the follicular phase. And just for simplistic terms, the luteal phase is the first half of the cycle. And that is when you're producing a lot of estrogen or more estrogen than progesterone. The last half of the cycle in the follicular phase, you're trying to produce a follicle to be fertilized to get pregnant. And that's when the progesterone is higher. Naturally, progesterone should be higher during the last half of the cycle, the follicular phase. Now, let's talk about what progesterone literally means. Progesterone, Latin. Pro means for or to support. Gesterone, gestation, for or to support gestation. If you don't have enough progesterone, you cannot cycle regularly and you cannot get pregnant or stay pregnant. There are many women we have worked with for years that have went to fertility clinics and spent thousands of dollars. They never checked a progesterone level. And they came to our pharmacy. We referred them to somebody. They took progesterone, started cycling regularly, and they were pregnant within 8 weeks. That's happened more than a handful of times that we know of. So progesterone is super important when it comes to any kind of cycling issue, any kind of pregnancy issue. So when you're young, progesterone, 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 and when you're older, but we'll get to that later.
So what Shawn described is in the first part of the phase, estrogen is going to build the lining within our uterus. And then at mid phase, where we want the egg to be released and fertilized in a cycle, if we were to become pregnant or wanted to become pregnant, progesterone is going to make that environment healthy enough to happen or maintain it. But when we don't become pregnant and the egg doesn't become fertilized, then progesterone will drop off and signal the body to go into a period or a cycle. And the benefit of having this normal rhythm is not having too much of a lining buildup, so it's thick and heavy and uncomfortable and lots of bloating and all the migraines, headaches and achiness. It keeps the estrogen in line, so you don't go too thick of a lining, but you make it proper or healthy for a fertilized egg to be implanted in the womb.
And let's talk about some other issues that can affect a cycle. Let's talk about exercise, Janet.
Right. So in young women in particular, if you see some of, like I'll say Olympic athletes, for example, if you're looking at gymnasts, I'm sure at the amount of body fat that some of these young women have, it could be swimmers, it could be, runners.
Basketball players or
Right.
runners, elite athletes when they're younger.
The lack of body fat can cause issues with having a cycle, or when we get into the extreme situation that we're seeing in most of the population of our country right now, when we have a population with young people who are putting on extra weight, who are overweight or becoming obese. Those two extremes really put you at a fertility risk or a cycling risk. I think the athlete will eventually come around. I believe that, because once they don't work out so hard, their body will start doing that, but they still put some stress on their body for their bones. And obviously that's going to balance out slightly with their activity. But the worst place that you could be as an American, or even a young woman for that matter, wherever you live, is having obesity or overweight, because we don't seem to know how to handle the metabolic imbalances that are going to happen in our body. So we don't make the bones like we need, we don't make the muscles, and we store fat, and we just don't feel good. So, I mean, that's part of it. So diet, exercise, and sleep are super important. I don't want people to go to the extreme where they hurt themselves with too much working out. But at the same time, we have to balance that. A healthy body needs to move, and we need to be aware of where we should be for a healthy weight. And I don't believe in buying into this culture lie that we should just pretend that it's okay, because if you're metabolically ill, it's not okay.
No.
Because what diseases are we setting our body up for, Shawn?
Well, the number one killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease, and it's linked to obesity. And just here's a little tip. It's not about cholesterol.
No.
Let's face it. If it was about cholesterol, the cholesterol medications, the statins, Mevacor, lovastatin, came out in 1987. It's been out for over 35 years. And yet cardiovascular disease is an all-time high in America. Why is that? It's not because the cholesterol meds aren't lowering their cholesterol, because they are. It's not because they're not being prescribed enough, because they are. It's because it's more metabolic diseases causing inflammation, usually related to obesity, is why people are dying from cardiovascular disease. And what else are they dying from? Cardiovascular disease is also a complication of diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is a carbohydrate metabolism problem by definition. Diabetes mellitus, type 2 or type 1, they're treated different and they're manifest different, but they're still diabetes mellitus literally means honey siphon in Greek. Okay. What does that mean? That means you're urinating out sugar, is basically what that means. So how do you prevent type 2 diabetes and this metabolic dysfunction? You limit your carbohydrates. You limit the amount of food you're eating. You fast more often. Fasting is not dangerous. Don't let anybody tell you that fasting is dangerous. Our bodies are very, very good at storing energy. That's why many people have abdominal obesity, because we store energy there as fat. So our bodies are trained to fast for days at a time if it is necessary. So most people have a overeating problem, not a fasting problem.
Right. So what we're describing to you, what happens at the cellular level for some people that are really interested, is that usually when we're young, we can make enough insulin when we eat those sugars. But what ends up happening when we focus on carbs or processed food, because really that's what it is, usually is processed, is that our body says, hey, I need you to release more insulin to take care of it. But then when it gets to the cellular level, it's like, I've got way too much. I don't want any more. So your body has this constant cycle going on. And if you're not getting the nutrients inside of the cell, you're just going to start storing it in other places versus bringing it in and utilizing that energy. And that's a big problem, because if we start seeing, in which we already are, cardiovascular issues starting to creep in and diabetes creeping into our young women, especially teen and young 20s, when you become pregnant, this becomes a huge
if you could
issue.
become pregnant.
Right. And the problem is that right now, what the standard of care out there in America is for somebody who has diabetes is give them all the carbs they want, and then we will treat them with something from Big Pharma. But folks, that's a lie. And as a young person, you should know that's a complete lie. That's not giving you the right answer. So it's super important to understand that your nutrition needs to involve good fats, good proteins, and carbs. And the carbs should be from fruits and vegetables, not from a box or a candy wrapper.
And let's just reverse that. Vegetables and fruit.
Well, right.
Because probably more vegetables than fruit if you tend to be pre-diabetic. If you're pre-diabetic, then you want to be really careful with fruit.
Right.
Because it's a carbohydrate metabolism problem, and fruit is high in carbohydrates. And what Janet's saying about, so glucose, if you guys have heard of diabetes, usually the telltale sign of diabetes is a glucose above 100, a fasting glucose above 100. And that's not the best test for diabetes, in my opinion, because it will not catch things that are early. It will not catch diabetes early. You can catch it 10 years earlier than if you check a fasting insulin. That's what's more important. Insulin is what our bodies produce to try to lower our glucoses. So if a glucose our body makes as the main energy source, I know the keto people will debate with me, but we will die without glucose in our bodies. We don't necessarily die with very little ketones in our bodies. So that's my argument about glucose. And our body can make glucose, which is the main energy for all the production in our body, in our cells, can make it from many different sources, whether it be fat, whether it be carbohydrates, whether it be proteins, gluconeogenesis, whether it be our glycogen in our glycogen stores in our body. So we can get glucose from anywhere we need possible. So when that glucose gets high because you're eating bad, then you get a lot of insulin released. But like Janet says, insulin's released in our pancreas. Finally, your pancreas says, I can't release any more insulin.
Mm-hmm.
And then what do they want to do? They want to give you drugs. Well, guess what? Giving you insulin is like putting fuel on the fire,
right,
gasoline on the fire, literally. And you don't lack Ozempic, you don't lack semaglutide, Wegovy, all those drugs are using for weight loss. You don't lack those things.
Oh, and please don't
No.
when you're a teenager.
No,
Please don't do this, because your bones need real food.
And your muscles.
Because the weight that you're going to lose on those drugs is really going to be the building blocks to your health. And if you take that away from you in your early stages,
don't do it.
We're going to see some big problems. So let's kind of shift over to maybe some easy topics, because, you know, if we are thinking about young women that might consider having a child, you know, there's also some supplements that we should think about, because even if we ate perfectly from all the foods that we get today, we know that we need to do some supplementation. And maybe even let's talk about first, before we get on that totally, what could we do for a young woman that's having migraines besides our progesterone and regulating her cycle, Shawn? What supplements would you recommend to her?
Well, I would recommend first of all, before we even talk about migraines in young women, let's just talk about supplementation in general. If there is one supplement that you can take, I don't care what age you are, the most important supplement you can take, in my opinion, is vitamin D. Almost everybody is low on vitamin D. Most people need between 5 and 10,000 units a day. Vitamin D is a hormone in itself. It's got a cholesterol backbone. It does many things in the body, like a lot of hormones do. And it builds strong bones. It helps for brain health. It helps for depression, seasonal affective disorder. Especially in northern latitudes, we don't get enough of it, even in the summer, because the sun rays don't hit us. Vitamin D is produced in the sun or in our skin in response to sunlight. Obviously, in northern latitudes, when it's dark most of the year and we're not outside, we're inside when it's light, you don't get enough vitamin D production. And even down in southern latitudes, most people don't get enough because they're either not outside enough, or when they're outside, they cover up. They wear sunscreen, which that's a topic for a whole other story or a whole other show. But or they, wear long sleeves so they don't get sunburned. So then you don't get enough vitamin D. So vitamin D supplementation, 5 to 10,000 units a day for most people. But if a woman is having cyclical headaches, the first thing I would recommend is progesterone. So take progesterone, especially in the last half of that cycle,
which is a hormone,
in the luteal phase of the cycle. And I think, did I back that up? Did I get follicular phase and luteal phase mixed up the first of the show?
Mm.
Either way, follicular phase is the first half of the cycle. Janet talked about that. Luteal phase is the second half of the cycle, where progesterone is being produced in a high amount. So progesterone and then a good B complex.
Right.
B vitamins are very important for those headaches. And if you're going to do a B complex, make sure it's methylated Bs.
Mm-hmm.
So L-methylfolate and methylcobalamin for B12.
Right. And those are really important to not be depleted on, especially if we're planning to become pregnant, because we know that that prevents birth defects. And having the methylated form just means it's more absorbable. But many of the people in our culture have lack the gene to be able to methylate these products and absorb them. So don't even bother buying the others. Just buy some that are methylated, and then you will have a good product. Yeah. And I think that that's important for just understanding that even for our avoiding having issues with headaches, it helps preventing having a long problem with birth defects, but just even building good tissue. B vitamins are so involved in so many different processes. It's not just, one thing. It's everywhere. Our brain health, our gut health. I mean, so they're super important on that. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about gut health, because I feel like that could play into a role. Since we kind of went there.
You just triggered something when you said gut health. So I'm like, yeah, here's one of the things. If you don't have a healthy gut in the first place, you can't absorb those B vitamins. So gut health is very, very important. You can't absorb vitamin D. You can't absorb nutrients and micronutrients and macronutrients to your optimum without proper gut health. So gut health is very important. What would you say about gut health, Janet? Other than eating real food,
right?
Non-processed food, real food.
So in the last few years, we've lived this fairy tale of germs and viruses and fungus and bacteria are bad for us. But we need to realize as an organism that we need them inside and out. We carry pounds of them externally and internally, and their job is very important. So where it starts becoming a problem for gut health is usually when we have the scenario when we've been on antibiotics, and most Americans have, in probably at least once a year. And if you're fortunate not to, that's great. But that's really important. So if we have an absorption problem, it's probably because either we're eating bad or we've been on an antibiotic that's wiped it out. So having those organisms put back into the gut is going to increase the absorption of nutrients. And that includes from our food to our supplements. And, you might think that that's not a big deal, but it really is, because then if we don't absorb it correctly, that sets you up for GI problems too. And then if you become pregnant, there's a whole nother game with that. So easy fix with that is if you go on an antibiotic or have been put on an antibiotic, you need to take probiotics to replace it. They're loaded with different bacteria that our gut would normally have to have a healthy absorption and healthy, we would call it symbiotic environment. The other thing that could be super important, and I know we're talking teenagers and young women, but there are things that we do in our society that lower our ability to absorb food. So what would those things be, Shawn?
What would we do to our ability to
alcohol?
Yeah.
We're talking about young people.
Yeah. So there's many drugs, and alcohol is a drug that is going to help us, that is going to hinder us from absorbing our food properly. And yeah, alcohol is one of them. Semaglutide, which they're using for weight loss, Ozempic and Wegovy, those drugs will make it so you're not absorbing the nutrients that we should get from our food. It stops our GI tract, called gastroparesis, and then we have bad absorption of our nutrients. So when we talk about processed foods, basically it's really simple. I have a thing that I like to say: if it doesn't rot, don't eat it. And so, you know what? Your steak, your hamburger, don't buy the lie that red meat is bad for you. Let's talk about that in young women. Young women, especially that are cycling, they have a problem with iron deficiency many times. There is no better way to increase your iron stores than red meat, period. And so eat real food. And you won't have as many problems. It's hard to overeat real food. It's easy to overeat processed foods when it's boxed up.
So we hope that you learned something from this. As my goal is that hopefully I won't have to have you in our office or call or end up in that situation when you're searching for help and you've been, I guess, given the American standard of care where you've been put on the pill. Now you still have migraines, or you want to become pregnant and they put you on, all these gamut of things. Really, let's start the building block when we're young. Let's do it right, folks, because you get one chance in this life, right? And your younger years are, we give ourselves like a little freedom because we're young, but this is super important for young girls to lay down the building blocks now, because as you go along in life, it's going to mean a lot, whether you want to have a child or whether you want to maintain good, healthy bones as you age into your 80s and 90s. Let's do it now. Let's start now, right? Because it's easier to stay on the path. There's less problems along the way. I mean, if I could take back all the pitfalls and the bad stories that I've heard about young women that have miscarried and the tragedies of some of this that happens to them when they have early surgeries to have, just rather than let's fix the problem, let's just do a hysterectomy and take another 10 years off your life. So don't do that. Don't go into menopause early on the birth control pill, and don't let them do a hysterectomy unless it's warranted. So, the way we solve this in our lives is doing the best we can with the choices that we have, and do the best we can with balancing things with people that understand. So where would I send somebody to get their hormones balanced if we were young?
Where would we send somebody? Well, it depends on where they live. And I would send them to a practitioner that specializes in hormones. And typically, that's not your typical traditional doctor. It's not your typical traditional OBGYN either. Now, there are some OBGYNs out there that do specialize in hormones and do a good job of it. But they're, OBGYNs by their nature are surgeons. Right. So they do C-sections and they do hysterectomies. So they do a lot of hysterectomies in younger women that have bleeding issues. And if you have a cycling issue, a bleeding issue, progesterone, you don't need a hysterectomy, and birth control pills are just a temporary fix, a band-aid at best. So our goal is to educate and empower people to take charge of their own health. And we want to make sure that you have a choice. So remember, it is your choice. It is your body. So if you don't trust a healthcare professional, what they're saying, get a second opinion. Right. Reach out to somebody that knows about hormones and knows about these issues before you take drastic steps. So I hope you enjoyed our topic today. Stay tuned for episode 2, where we just slowly progress as a woman gets older. Thank you so much.